am Uday Bhaskar and I am a columnist for the Tribune. In my latest article, I have focused on the talks in Tehran, the talks between the United States and Iran, wherein the Pakistani Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir had acted as a facilitator, playing a very valuable role and carrying a message from Washington to Tehran. And this was a very, very important meeting. It followed the first round of talks between the United States and Iran, which were held in Islamabad earlier in April. And at that time, the US Vice President, Mr. J.D. Vance, had led the US delegation, making this the first time that there was such a high level, direct, person to person contact between Iran and the United States after the 1979 hostage crisis when President Jimmy Carter was in the White House. So, currently, of course, the war against Iran, the one launched by the United States and Israel, which began on the 28th of February, the end of February, has crossed the 50-day mark. And it has had a very adverse, a very negative impact on global energy stability and by extension, the global economy. The most affected have been major oil importers, particularly in Asia and in Europe, such as China, India, Japan, and many other countries in Asia dependent on oil and energy from the Persian Gulf. And here the Strait of Hormuz has assumed a very, very critical role. So the talks in Tehran were about opening the Hormuz, since Iran and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps had taken control of the transit in the Strait of Hormuz, and consequently there's been no significant traffic in that particular choke point. And this is a huge contrast given that pre-28th of February, before Epic Fury, the war began, the normal transit was between 140 to 150 ships on a daily basis. This has now come down to almost zero because of the blockade imposed by the US Navy and the regulations put in place by Iran. So the talks in Tehran were ostensibly about trying to find a modus vivendi, and initially the reports were very favorable. Iran announced that the Hormuz would be open and the impact on the global oil market was almost immediate, and the price of Brent crude came down by almost 10%. But this optimism was very short-lived, because on Friday, after Iran's announcement that the Hormuz would be opened, US President Donald Trump, in characteristic manner, put out a post on social media where he welcomed the Hormuz being opened, but added that the US Navy would continue to maintain a blockade on Iranian ports till such time as a comprehensive deal was reached, which really meant the Iranian nuclear program. Once this became public, predictably, Iran reversed its position and said that the Hormuz was no longer open. This happened over the weekend. And that is the current impasse, the current status quo, which is in the Hormuz. It's a very tense situation. And over the weekend, to enforce its own writ, the IRGC fired on a few merchant ships which were trying to exit the Hormuz, and these included 2 Indian flagged ships, and this has caused a lot of concern in Delhi. The Foreign Ministry in Delhi summoned the Iranian ambassador and conveyed their own concern. And coming into Monday, the United States, President Donald Trump, has again repeated what could only be called as a threat, that if Iran does not accept a deal, then the bombs would start dropping again. So this is where we are now. The Tehran talks have concluded in a very inconclusive manner. There is no clarity about the Hormuz. There is no agreement between the United States and Iran. So the de facto position is no ships are moving. The United States has escalated in terms of its own demands and what it expects from Iran, particularly a no nuclear Iran, meaning that the United States, in many of its public statements, has dwelt on removing the enriched uranium from Iran and that the United States would keep it in safe custody. Now, there is no particular legal framework for this, but law hardly matters in the current context, given the way in which the United States and Israel have prosecuted this war against Iran. Therefore, to that extent, the current situation is that while Tehran, the talks have remained inconclusive, President Trump is putting his foot on the pedal. He has announced that by Wednesday, which is when the ceasefire agreed to in the first round of talks in Islamabad from April 8th to April 22nd, would expire on Wednesday. And if Iran does not agree to the US framework, whatever be the demands the United States has listed, starting with the nuclear issue and the opening up of the Hormuz and various other elements in that draft, bombs would start dropping again. Given Iran's own resolve, Tehran has rejected the American demands, and we have to wait and watch and see what will happen on Wednesday. As a carrot, President Trump had hinted that if there is a successful deal, as he would like to call it, he might consider visiting Islamabad. That would be a very major step, and it would also give enormous boost to Pakistan's own role as a facilitator, as a mediator, and a nation that could bring about a certain rapprochement between the United States and Iran. And at a remove, Israel is also a player. It has been playing a spoiler's role. But we have to wait and watch. Personally, I think that it's unlikely that Iran will accept these draconian conditions that are being sought to be imposed by the United States. And while President Trump has again threatened to bomb Iran, and he's particularly spoken about infrastructure and power plants and such kind of civilian facilities, it's very unlikely that Iran will take this lying down. Already there have been reports about the proxies, such as the Houthis in Yemen, threatening to close the Bab el-Mandab. That, you may recall from the map, is the route towards the Red Sea at the tip of the Arabian Peninsula. So effectively, if the Hormuz is already de facto blocked and the Bab el-Mandab is also closed to traffic, it would be a global economic and energy crisis of multiple order, in contrast to what the world is facing now. It's a very dire situation, and we'll have to see how Wednesday unfolds and what kind of developments take place. Because the reality for countries like India and many other importers are the 3F challenge is going to become very grave. The 3 F's are F for fuel, fuel related to fertilizers, and fertilizers related to food. And generally, the global supply chain is of about 45 days, meaning that ships that had exited the Hormuz before the 28th of February would now be delivering whatever cargo and energy they may have carried over a 6-week period. That 6-week period, 45 days, is over. And the real challenge will be felt from now onwards, because there has been no significant movement of cargo, whether energy or otherwise, since the last 50 days, almost 50 days. So, therefore, whether it is LPG cylinders in countries like India or the rest of Asia, Africa, Europe, which are feeling the bite, I think the adverse detrimental impact of the war against Iran will slowly become more acute, and human security across the world is going to be very, very severely degraded.